Mick Jagger isn't just a rock star, he's an empire. And empires aren't built without stepping on a few toes. For decades, people have debated, is Jagger a genius or a manipulator? His unmatched energy on stage made him one of the most electrifying performers of all time. But behind the scenes, Mick was cold, calculating, and always 2 steps ahead. Unlike many rock stars who let managers run their careers, Jagger controlled everything: the finances, the contracts, the branding. Some called it smart, others called it ruthless. Keith Richards often complained that Mick treated the Rolling Stones like a corporation rather than a band, and that corporate mindset didn't always sit well with his bandmates. It all started as a brotherhood. In 1961, a teenage Mick Jagger met Keith Richards on a train platform in Dartford, England. A simple conversation about blues records sparked a partnership that would redefine rock music. But that partnership came with a cost. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the Rolling Stones were a global phenomenon. But with fame came excess, and with excess came conflict. One of the earliest cracks in Jagger and Richards' relationship came from their wildly different approaches to life and music. Mick, always the businessman, wanted to keep the Stones professional. Keith, on the other hand, was diving headfirst into rock star excess, heroin, arrests, and chaos. Mick hated it. He thought Keith was becoming unreliable. And when Keith was arrested for heroin possession in Toronto in 1977, Mick saw an opportunity. During Keith's legal troubles, Jagger took control of the band. He negotiated deals, booked tours, and positioned himself as the leader of the Rolling Stones. Some saw it as Mick stepping up. Keith saw it as betrayal. Keith would later say, "Mick took the reins because he thought I was finished, but I wasn't, and I never forgot it." As the 80s arrived, the music industry was changing. Punk, new wave, and MTV were dominating. Mick saw an opportunity to reinvent himself, without the Stones. Jagger released his first solo album, She's the Boss, in 1985. Critics were divided, but what angered Keith Richards the most was that Mick was suddenly too busy to tour with the Stones. Keith, furious, called Mick's solo career a load of bollocks. He accused Mick of abandoning the band for a pop career, and in return, Mick called Keith a heroin-soaked relic of the past. The feud exploded into what became known as World War III of the Rolling Stones. The 1986 album Dirty Work was basically a fight set to music. The band barely spoke. Mick refused to tour. Keith, in response, wrote the song Had It With You, a direct attack on Jagger. By 1988, Keith Richards had enough. He released his own solo album Talk Is Cheap, taking shots at Mick. He publicly stated, "If Mick wants to be Michael Jackson, let him." Mick wasn't just fighting with Keith. Even Charlie Watts, the band's quiet and disciplined drummer, once lost his patience with Jagger. In 1984, during a drinking session with Keith Richards, a drunk Mick Jagger made a big mistake. He picked up the phone, called Charlie's hotel room at 5 a.m., and slurred, "Where's my drummer?" Charlie, a man known for his precision and class, did not take this lightly. He calmly got out of bed, shaved, put on a suit, polished his shoes, walked downstairs, and punched Mick Jagger straight in the face, knocking him to the ground. Keith Richards later recalled, "Charlie grabbed Mick by the lapels and said, 'Don't ever call me your drummer again. You're my singer.'" It was a rare moment where someone stood up to Jagger and won. Jagger's control over the band didn't just cause fights, it defined his entire career. He was obsessed with keeping the Rolling Stones relevant. While other rock legends faded, Jagger constantly reinvented the band, deciding their musical direction, business deals, and image. This control led to constant power struggles. Bill Wyman, the band's bassist, left the Stones in 1993, later saying he couldn't stand the internal politics, especially Mick's ego. Even outside of the band, Mick's attitude created tension. In the 90s, he clashed with David Bowie over who had the bigger solo career, and in the 2000s, Paul McCartney took a jab at the Stones, calling them a blues cover band, to which Jagger sarcastically replied, "Well, at least we're still playing." Jagger's biggest rival might just be himself. For decades, he's been labeled as egotistical, manipulative, and even arrogant. But at the same time, he's also one of the greatest performers in rock history. His ability to command a stage is unmatched. Many musicians have tried to copy Jagger's style, his moves, his swagger, but no one has fully captured his essence. That's why, despite all the feuds, the Rolling Stones never truly fell apart. Today, Mick and Keith have what can only be described as a functional rivalry. They still bicker, they still take jabs at each other, but they also know that the Rolling Stones wouldn't exist without their unique tension. Keith once said, "Mick and I will be squabbling in wheelchairs, but we'll still be the Stones." So after 6 decades of fights, betrayals, and reconciliations, one thing is clear. The Rolling Stones are not just a band. They're a war zone. And somehow, through it all, the music keeps playing. Keith Richards wasn't the only Stone who had issues with Mick. Over the years, Jagger's leadership, or dictatorship, depending on who you ask, created tension with almost every member of the band. Bassist Bill Wyman was with the Stones for 30 years, but finally quit in 1993. Why? He was tired of the drama. Wyman once said he was exhausted by the band's inner conflicts and especially Jagger's control. He described Mick as brilliant, but completely self-absorbed. Wyman's departure didn't stop the band, but it was a warning sign. The Stones weren't as united as they seemed. Then there's Ronnie Wood. The guitarist joined the Stones in 1975, and while he's been with the band for decades, he's always been seen as the junior member. Part of the reason? Mick never fully treated him as an equal. Ronnie was kept on a salary for years, while Mick and Keith took most of the profits. It was only in the 90s that Ronnie was finally made a full financial partner in the band. Decades of playing, yet still treated as replaceable. But Mick Jagger's feuds didn't stop with the Stones. Over the years, he's clashed with some of the biggest names in music. For years, there's been a cold war between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. At first, they were friendly rivals, but as time went on, tensions grew. In 2021, Paul McCartney made headlines by calling the Rolling Stones a blues cover band. It was a dig at the fact that, unlike the Beatles, the Stones never drastically changed their sound. Mick fired back sarcastically, saying, "He's a sweetheart, but at least we're still playing stadiums." It was a reminder that, even in their 70s, these rock legends were still competing. Then there's David Bowie. In the 70s and 80s, Mick and Bowie had a complicated relationship, part friendship, part rivalry. They collaborated on the song Dancing in the Street, but behind the scenes, Bowie reportedly saw Mick as someone who copied trends rather than created them. He once told friends that Jagger's entire stage persona was borrowed from other artists, including James Brown and Little Richard. At the same time, rumors swirled that their friendship had taken unexpected turns. In her autobiography, Angie Bowie, David's ex-wife, claimed she once walked in on Mick and Bowie in bed together. Neither of them ever confirmed or denied it, but it only added to the mythology of their relationship. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Mick and Bowie respected each other, but they were never truly friends. Beyond the personal feuds, Jagger also made enemies in the music industry for his aggressive business moves, and sometimes even his own bandmates felt betrayed. In 1971, Jagger made a decision that changed the Stones forever. To avoid paying massive UK taxes, he moved the entire band to France. The result? The legendary Exile on Main Street album. But behind the scenes, this move wasn't just financial, it was a power play. By controlling where the band lived and worked, Jagger solidified his grip over the Stones. Keith Richards later admitted that he didn't even understand the financial side of the decision. Mick simply told him they had to leave England. Even decades later, Mick's business-first mindset caused controversy. In 2006, the Rolling Stones played the Super Bowl halftime show. But what most people don't know is that Jagger agreed to censor his own lyrics for the performance. Many fans saw this as selling out. Keith Richards was reportedly furious, believing the Stones should never bow to corporate pressure. But Mick didn't care. He wanted the exposure. It was another example of how Mick Jagger always put business first, even at the cost of rock and roll rebellion. So after all the fights, betrayals, and controversies, what's the final verdict on Mick Jagger? Is he the ultimate rock star? A brilliant businessman? A manipulative egomaniac? The truth is, He's all of the above. Mick Jagger's legacy is built on contradictions. He's one of the greatest performers in music history, but also one of the most divisive figures in rock. He's loved, he's hated. But one thing's for sure, he's impossible to ignore. What do you think about Mick Jagger? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into rock history.